Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at some recent predictions and observations. Pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, some fascinating material.
Yeah.
And you know what makes it even more interesting? Some of these observations seem to be playing out in real time as we speak.
Yeah, I mean, take, for instance, this disturbing news coming out of Prusice near Roko.
Right, a terrible tragedy.
So the news is reporting on a Wijewitiana officer. For those who don't know, that's a prison service officer. And he's alleged to have shot and killed his mother-in-law and daughter, critically injured his son, and then tried to take his own life. Just a horrible situation. And what's really kind of eerie is in a broadcast just a few days before this incident, I believe it was either Tuesday or Wednesday of last week, there was this premonition, shared a vision of a family murder taking place in a house, and the speaker himself even mentioned how unusual and disturbing that particular vision was for him.
Yeah, and it's really striking how that earlier premonition seems to directly correlate with this event in Prusice. I mean, we even saw comments from listeners who remembered hearing that very specific statement from the earlier broadcast.
Right, it really makes you think.
It does make you think about, these kinds of insights and how we process them when they seem to match up with reality.
Absolutely. It definitely gives you pause for sure now, moving from this tragedy to something that could maybe signal some wider shifts in our society. Let's look at what was observed about the real estate market. The video pointed out that there's been a huge increase in the number of houses and apartments listed for sale, but at the same time, there's a noticeable decrease in the number of buyers.
Well, that aligns with some basic economics, right? When you have more supply and less demand, it naturally puts downward pressure on prices. And the fact that we're seeing initial price reductions, particularly for higher priced properties, that could very well be an early sign that things are changing. And if we consider this alongside a possible economic slowdown where people are hesitant to make big investments, well, it makes sense. Things like interest rates and just general consumer confidence, they play a huge role here when borrowing gets more expensive or people feel uncertain about their finances. Big purchases like homes, they tend to slow down.
Right, exactly. And it was even suggested that this could be the beginning of a recession.
Yeah.
A time when it becomes much harder to sell certain assets. I mean, that's a sobering thought for those of you who are homeowners or thinking about buying a home. But let's take a turn here and maybe indulge in a bit of Polish TV nostalgia for a moment. The video mentioned the classic show Sonda.
Ah, Sonda. Yeah, that brings back memories for a lot of Poles of a certain generation. I mean, it was hugely popular, really well-respected program, especially back when there weren't that many TV choices. You basically had TVP1 and the up-and-coming TVP2, and the way the creators were described as a sheetly duet that really shows how much of an impact they had on viewers. Sonda was kośniczego, something truly extraordinary, and it played such an important role in popularizing science, making these complex topics accessible to everyone.
And it's interesting how Studio 2, the channel that aired Sonda, was often seen as the higher quality channel with great films and series like that classic Cosmos 1999. It just goes to show how much certain cultural moments and figures can really stick with us. But let's get back to the present, shall we? Talk about something a bit more immediate that affects all of us, the weather forecast for the coming spring and summer.
Well, the insight shared suggests that the start of summer will be quite pleasant, but then around midsummer, things might take a turn for the worse, with the prediction of about 2 weeks of rainy weather. Now, the later part of summer is supposed to be a bit more unpredictable compared to the beginning, but overall still warm.
Now, a listener actually asked specifically about a possible drought this summer. And while the general outlook points to a warm summer with that rainy period in the middle, the fact that the second half is described as being more capricious, well, that could mean some changes in rainfall. It doesn't completely rule out the possibility of some dry spells here and there. So it's something to keep in mind as we move into the warmer months. But now let's venture into a bit more speculative, but definitely intriguing territory, the realm of near future visions. And it seems like politics takes center stage here.
Yeah, there's a prediction that one of the presidential candidates might zwaluge themselves, essentially self-sabotage through some action or mistake. And along with that, there's a sense of political maneuvering going on with the intent to harm two particular candidates, maybe leading to a resignation or a big drop in their support. What are your initial thoughts on that?
Well, the interesting thing here is the suggestion of self-inflicted damage for one candidate and then these external pressures on two others. It makes you wonder what kind of miscalculation or revelation could lead to that kind of downfall, or what tactics might be used to undermine those two specific individuals. It really highlights how unpredictable political campaigns can be, and then there's that rather unsettling vision of an emergency situation.
Yeah, that was a vivid image. A large number of ambulances, sirens going full blast, all rushing to a single major incident somewhere in Poland. And the feeling associated with this was that it might be related to a viaduct, possibly in the Gdańsk region or northern Poland in general. But it's worth pointing out that this connection to a viaduct, it felt a bit tentative, almost like a detail that was part of the imagery, but not necessarily the core of the event itself. It makes you wonder about the nature of these visions and whether specific details are always meant to be taken literally.
Right. It's that tricky balance between a clear mental image and how we interpret those details. The sheer number of ambulances, though, that definitely paints a picture of a large-scale emergency with lots of people needing immediate medical attention. And then we have this really interesting case where a past prediction seems to have found its real-world counterpart.
Yeah, this is where the connection between insight and current events gets really interesting.
Right.
Remember that previous warning about a possible ecological disaster in the Czech Republic? Well, now we're seeing news reports about a state of emergency declared in the Olomouc region because of a major leak of toxic benzene after a train derailment near Hustopage nad Bivou, and some reports are even calling it potentially the biggest ecological catastrophe in the world. And this lines up with that earlier prediction of big smoke in the Czech Republic.
It's pretty remarkable to have that earlier, rather general warning about an ecological issue in the Czech Republic, and now it seems to be playing out in this specific and significant event. It really underscores the possibility that these insights can sometimes foreshadow major developments. And the video also touched on a few other visions, some maybe a bit more vague than others.
All right, these are the more ambiguous areas, but still worth considering as part of the bigger picture. There's this feeling of an impending problem related to the currency of a smaller but economically important nation. It's expected to cause a certain level of panic within that country, and warnings from banks. The initial feeling was the sound lira. And while Turkey and its lira were mentioned in response to a listener question, the first impression wasn't definitively the lira. It really gets you thinking about how interconnected the global economy is and how problems in one place can spread to others.
It's interesting how those impressions can sometimes sound like real names or terms, right? But the core idea here seems to be a potential weakness in a specific country's financial system. And then we move on to a vision about natural disasters in Southern Europe.
There was a strong sense of anticipation for very large fires in Southern Europe, particularly in Greece and Croatia, due to major drought conditions and intense heat waves. This extreme heat is also expected to briefly affect Poland, but to a lesser extent. And, with the growing global concerns about climate change and the patterns we're seeing of more frequent and intense heat waves, these kinds of predictions, they don't seem so far-fetched, unfortunately.
Sadly, no, they don't. We've seen those devastating wildfires in those areas in recent years, so this is a worrying prospect for sure. But shifting gears completely, there was this rather unusual vision about a fashion trend.
Yes, the image of ribbons becoming a fashion trend that was definitely unexpected, and it kind of stands out among the more serious predictions. It makes you think about the scope of these insights, how they can range from major global events to these seemingly small cultural shifts.
It really highlights the wide range of these visions, and then following that, we have a more disturbing vision suggesting potential conflict.
Yeah, this was a troubling image, intense fighting with sharp objects between two groups of people in a city. The initial feeling pointed towards Moldova, a smaller nation bordering Romania and Ukraine, although Serbia was mentioned briefly and then corrected. And the overall sense was that Moldova would suffer quite a bit from this conflict. And with the current geopolitical tensions in that part of the world, any vision suggesting violence and instability, there's definitely a cause for concern, especially for those of you who closely follow global affairs.
Absolutely. With the current geopolitical climate, any sign of potential conflict in that region is definitely something to watch closely. And finally, in this collection of glimpses into the near future, we have a memory of a past vision about air travel.
The memory of a vision involving a passenger plane flying unusually low for a prolonged period, ultimately ending in a tragic event. Yeah, it's a sobering reminder of the potential for unforeseen disasters in different aspects of our lives.
It is, and that brings us to a particularly noteworthy and poignant anecdote, a vision that was kept private for a long time, for understandable reasons.
This is a compelling story. Back in early 2011, a vision was shared with a journalist from Gazeta Pomorska, a Polish newspaper. And this vision involved a major attack on America with two skyscrapers collapsing. The journalist, understandably struggling with the weight and potential misinterpretation of such a vision, decided not to publish it at the time. It really speaks to the difficult choices journalists face when confronted with these extraordinary claims.
Imagine that for a moment, a premonition years before the 9/11 attacks of something eerily similar to that horrific event, and the journalist's reaction afterward is quite telling.
It is after the 9/11 attacks actually happened. The journalist reportedly contacted the speaker, expressing deep regret for not having published the vision years earlier. And what makes this story even more significant is that this same journalist had accurately predicted the banking crisis of 2008, further emphasizing the predictive abilities being discussed. It really underlines the complexities and uncertainties involved in interpreting and sharing this kind of sensitive information.
It certainly does so. As we wrap up this deep dive, we've explored a wide range of intriguing observations and predictions, from a tragedy that seems to mirror an earlier insight to potential changes in the economy, nostalgic reflections, weather forecasts, and some rather vivid glimpses into the near future, spanning political events, possible accidents, and environmental concerns.
And as always, it's crucial for you to think critically about these insights, to consider the context in which they were shared, and to use your own judgment. The fact that events like the ecological situation in the Czech Republic seem to be unfolding does give us pause.
It does. And on that note, here's a final thought for you to consider. Given all the connections and potential events we've discussed today, which future development do you think is most likely to occur, and what might be the driving forces behind it? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time.
See you then.